That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Yeah. I have considerably more chords here than I'm used to dealing with, so I'm hoping I don't trip, but if I do, I promise I'll get up. So I wanted to start tonight. Thank you so much for coming. And I'm like the hugest fan of public libraries, and I would just be thrilled if all my events were in public libraries. But I also am really thrilled to have Old Firehouse Books here. That is a huge gift as well from Fort Collins. And so thank you all for coming. And I decided to talk tonight about ways of looking for things that are hard to find. And that has become kind of a specialty of mine, I would say. I'm becoming a very good searcher. And so I thought I would start with a poem by Rainer Maria Rilke about searching. And I put it up here so that you can follow along, because I think poems are sometimes hard to just hear. Sometimes it helps to look at them. So I thought I would start with this poem. And this is from his The Book of a Monastic Life, and it's translated by our very own Joanna Macy. I think she lives in Boulder. I do love this translation. The poets have scattered you. A storm ripped through the stammering. I want to gather you up again in a vessel that makes you glad. I wander in the thousand winds that you are churning and bring back everything I find. The blind man needed you as a cup. The servant concealed you. The beggar held you out as I passed. You see, I am one who likes to look for things. I am one who, barely noticed like a shepherd, comes up from behind. One who dreams of making you complete, and in that way completes himself. So it was especially for me the line, you see, I am one who likes to look for things, that really caught my attention when I read this poem. And I was like, wait, I am one who likes to look for things. And so then I felt like I had a friend. But another thing that was really significant to me, especially in this story, was these lines about becoming a beggar, about the beggar who needed you as a cup. The servant who concealed you, the blind man needed you as a cup, the servant concealed you, the beggar held you out as I passed. Because I feel like there's something in this work that I'm going to talk about tonight, and this thing that I did that was very much about becoming a beggar, very much becoming a person with empty hands, who really didn't know what she was doing, didn't really know how to begin, and I'll talk about sort of how that happened. But in essence, I felt very much like the poorer I became as I did this, the more likely I was to find things. And the more that I was already sort of filled up with stuff I knew, or things I thought I knew, or plans I had, or inspirations I thought I was following, the less I found myself finding. So there's something really important for me, and became even more important as I undertook this trip, which I'll describe in a minute, as I went along. Because it proved true, basically. Because the more empty I was, the more hopeless, the more lost, the more confused, the less likely I was to find something, the more beggar-like I became, the more likely I was to stumble on the very thing I was looking for, or to transform my understanding in some way. And so that is another reason why this poem has taken on a lot of significance for me in this work. So I thought I would start with the concept of quest, because one of the ways to understand what I did was to go on a quest. And this is something that emerged a little bit over time, to call it this, a quest. In fact, it emerged so late that I actually forgot that I called it this. And when Rabbi Hillel in Fort Collins was interviewing me for his radio show, he read the title of my book. And I wanted to correct him, that quest is not in the title. And then I thought, well, that's kind of rude to correct him, because I thought the word I had chosen for the title was search. And quest is a little bit more elevated of a term, right? So like search, you don't quest for your keys, for example, right? You don't go around, I'm not questing for my keys, I'm just looking for them, or I'm searching for them. But quest also has a little bit of humor in it, which is one of the reasons I eventually, embraced it and used it. Because every time I would say to my mother, for example, when we were traveling, and I would say, well, what should we do today? And she'd say, well, let's do something for the quest. So we sort of took on that tone, a little bit slightly elevated tone. But the other thing I really like about questing as a verb and as a description of what we're sort of after tonight is that it immediately invites you into the context of myth, right? If you're on a quest, you immediately understand that you are in the realm of myth. And I kind of have this idea that we're all living our myths. We all are in the middle of a myth. I talked to a friend the other day who was like, oh, I just had so much fun at home yesterday because I just, I let the rabbits out. She has rabbits. I let the rabbits out and they were running around and I was just doing little things around the house. And the more we talked about it, the more we were struck by the fact that she was being Snow White. Like she was living in her little cottage and talking to her little animals. And the next thing that was going to happen was like some bird was going to fly and sit on her windowsill and start talking to her, right? So even in the middle of doing nothing, she's just being at home. She was in a way enacting or being a part of a myth. And I think quest invites us to do that. Now my quest was multifaceted. So I just want to give you a quick description in case you have no idea what we're talking about. So I became fascinated by spending some time in a library with a woman named Mary of Egypt. And she lived probably sometime in the 5th century. And she came from somewhere in Egypt and then traveled from Egypt through to Alexandria, which is on the north end of Egypt. She lived there for about 17 years. Then she went to Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem, she had a kind of life-changing experience, which we'll definitely talk about as part of this search. She had a life-changing experience in the courtyard of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And after that experience, she went into the desert, and she lived in the desert for the rest of her life. In the Jordanian wilderness is where she lived. And then at a certain point, a monk named Zosimus came to the desert on a search, on a quest of his own. He was, first of all, we should talk about Mary's quest maybe, and then I'll go back to Zosimus's quest. So Mary starts her quest in a search for pleasure. At least that's how she tells the story. So she leaves home, and we really don't know why she left home. She really leaves that area a huge blank in her story. All she tells you is that she left her family and she went to Alexandria, where she took up life as a prostitute. And in Alexandria, when she was 29 years old, she was on the bank of the sea, and she was watching pilgrims come and go. And they were all headed to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for the Feast of the Holy Cross. And this was a time when pilgrimage was a very big deal in Christianity, and lots of people were undertaking these pilgrimages. So there were whole boats of people heading to Jerusalem for the Feast of the Holy Cross. So she said to the pilgrims, how do I get on that boat? I want to go to Jerusalem. So she was, in a sense, seeking adventure, right? She wanted a bigger world. She wanted to see something new. She wanted to try something different. And so one of the pilgrims said to her, well, you can go if you like, but you have to have money. And she said, well, I don't have money, but I have sex. And so she sold sex to pilgrims and used that as her means to get to Jerusalem. And then she had this, so I think that it's decently fair to say that when she was on that beach in Alexandria, that her search, her quest began with something like a quest for pleasure, a quest for adventure, a quest for new experience, which is very often how we ourselves experience pleasure, right? Through doing something new, trying something new. So this was Mary. Now Zosimus started his adventure in a very different way. He was a monk, and the manuscript that we have that talks about Zosimus says that he was a monk from the oldest monasteries, and that he had been left in the monastery as a child. And so he'd grown up in the monastery, and he'd become, by the age of 53, the best monk there was. And his own assessment, and apparently in the assessment of many other people who would come to get teaching from him, he was really, really good at being a monk. And he heard this voice in his head. I mean, the manuscript doesn't even say where the voice was located. I'm just sort of guessing that it was in his head, but it could have been some other monk telling him, like, this isn't a really good idea to be the best monk there is. This isn't really good monkness to think you are the best, right? And so he leaves his monastery in a quest for the end of self-righteousness, for the end of self-satisfaction. And he goes in search of a teacher. Because one of the things that he had determined at this age and this stage of his life is that he had no more teachers. No one left to teach him. So he left the monastery in search of a teacher who could teach him how to be more holy than he had been. So then there's me, I'm also on a quest, right? And it's just a strange thing. Like, what was I on a quest for? I had become really fascinated with this woman. She'd sort of started to obsess me. I wanted to know more. I wanted to understand more. And the first thing I did in my quest to understand Mary better was to study Greek. Because I had this idea that if I just read the ancient manuscript that we have about Mary of Egypt in Greek, then I would get it. And I had this idea just briefly because I had written this book about Julian of Norwich. And when I read Julian of Norwich in the Middle English, I felt like all of a sudden I just was awake to Julian. I understood who she was. And so that's where the idea came that if I just read Mary of Egypt's story in Greek, then I would understand Mary of Egypt. This did not work. And I'll talk about this in a minute. So I've kind of covered the first way of looking for things here. Usually don't use slides, so if I just start rambling and talking and I forget, I'll skip through a few of these and you'll see where we are in my plan here. But anyway, so the first thing is questing, and I like questing as a paradigm, because one of the things I had to understand as I went in search of Mary of Egypt was that I was in the world of as if Mary of Egypt lived, as if these were the places that she walked in. Because the manuscript that we have, basically what happened is I took that manuscript, I did learn Greek, I did study it, and what I came to understand was the person who wrote it. I came to understand a great deal about him. His name is Sophronius, and I can talk about him all you want in the questions, but I didn't end up liking him very much. I just ended up, with a pretty good understanding of who he was as a person through the reading of that manuscript. But Mary of Egypt, very different from Julian of Norwich, didn't have a voice really in that manuscript. She didn't write it. It was written probably a couple hundred years after she lived. And so there's even a very strong question among at least American scholars, certainly Western scholars, about whether she was even just a myth, whether she was not even a person. Somebody that was made up by the monks or by Sophronius to edify themselves and to tell themselves stories that were both entertaining and edifying to them. So so it wasn't even clear that she was a real person, for one thing. So I needed to understand myself in the realm of myth. I needed to understand that I was starting out from this place of as if. And that category became a really important one for me as a writer and a thinker. But I should say that as a journalist and as a scholar, as if these are not exactly appropriate categories, right? Like, you don't as if your research, you don't go out as if somebody was a real person, right? I mean, these are the things that, I don't know. But eventually I understood that I had to take everything I'd ever learned as a scholar and everything I'd ever learned as a journalist and then apply it in this a little bit more mythical, a little bit stranger world. And that was how I was going to undertake this journey. Because eventually I came to the conclusion that what I had to do to understand Mary of Egypt was to put myself on the ground and try to close the gap between Mary of Egypt and me in space. If I couldn't close it in time and I couldn't close it through language, I decided to try to close it through geography. So I took this 7th century manuscript that I had studied, and I turned it basically into a map. And then I tried to figure out how to walk this map, how to travel this map that I had made. And that's where research comes in. And when I think about research, I think about I think about three kinds of questions. There are questions that have answers, and as a English major with a PhD in literature, I was stunned. There are questions that have answers, and you can find them. And I mean, this is like, to me, it was such a revelation. Like, it's especially true when I was writing my book about Julian, but I'd go to the library and I'd say, so tell me about how they baked bread for communion in the Middle Ages. And then you could find out, and it was so fascinating. Or how did they make ink? And that sort of thing. And I would just I'd spend hours lost in those kinds of questions, because to me it was just so exciting that you could ask a question like that. You could stumble into a library, and ask somebody, and they would help you find the answer to those kinds of questions. We didn't really do that, when I was studying literature at Duke. You just asked these other kinds of questions, which were questions really that don't have answers. And I really, really like those kinds of questions too. I spent a great deal of time on them. They just weren't quite as exciting as the ones that have answers, because ultimately what I love to do in my work is take the literal and the metaphoric and start walking them together. And that's why it becomes so exciting to me how ink is made, or what kind of bread monks put in their pockets to carry out into the wilderness, or what they ate there. Is because it's very exciting and very interesting on the one level, but also because for me, all of those things start to work on multiple levels. They start to work metaphorically as well as literally, and I find that really exciting. So that's why I like questions that don't have answers as well as questions that do. But sometimes the most interesting questions are the kind where you don't have an answer and you can't find an answer, but you have to have it. So you can't move forward until you have an answer to this question, and yet you're aware that it doesn't have an answer. Let me just give you an example from the life of Mary of Egypt. So one of the things that she says about her life as a prostitute is that no one ever paid her. She never earned any money from being a prostitute. She never took money. And she explains that in the 7th century manuscript by telling Zosimus that was because she loved having sex so much that she never took money for it. Okay. What do I, as a researcher, do with that kind of mystery? I mean, on the one hand, you could say, okay, she likes to have sex. Great. We have in our Christian tradition, which has so much Puritanism in it and so much denial of pleasure and so much sense of locking people behind doors and not talking about sexuality. We have a saint who loved to have sex and who talks about it in the manuscript. This is great. Let's just go that way, right? We'll just go with her story. And then you start to put Mary of Egypt's story in the context of sexuality in the 5th century, especially the sexuality of a very, very poor woman who had abandoned, even if she did come from some kind of wealthy background, which is highly unlikely, but even if she did, she gave it all up. She abandoned every connection, every source that she had. Why did she do that? Probably because of violence of one kind or another. Probably because whatever it was her family offered her, she thought she could probably do better as a street prostitute in Alexandria, which is not that uncommon, even today. People, young girls run away from home in conditions of violence in all kinds of settings, or they're sold, which is also a possibility for Mary of Egypt, right? That her family sold her, or that she was kidnapped. St. Augustine talks about this in his own churches in I can't remember what source, but in his sermons he talks about young girls who were kidnapped by slavers and taken and sold into prostitution. So this could be true of Mary of Egypt. So when I hear her words about finding sex so pleasurable that she never took money for it, I also hear it in that exploitative context. And I think about it as she's a child. She's 12 years old when she runs away from home, according to the manuscript. So then suddenly it isn't so easy to take her words at face value and to say that makes sense. In fact, what I sort of started to think about it was like some kind of ancient joke. Mary of Egypt, as I learned more about her, she became a very tricky personality for me. She's a very tricky person, I think. And I think of it almost like a joke, where she's like, well, I never made any money. That guy did, right? So I just did it for the pleasure. So sometimes I thought about her like that, like a sort of, like she's just ignoring the context in which her exploitation took place. And because she doesn't want us to get distracted by that. And of course, in our day and time, we have a lot more resources to think about social context. In her particular moment and in the moment of that manuscript, what's important is that she takes full responsibility. That's what the monks who go into the desert do. They take full responsibility. This isn't anybody else's fault. There are no victims here. I made my choices and I live with them. That's the language of the monks of the desert of that particular time. So she spoke that language. Now, did she speak that language or does Sophronius speak that language? You see the problem. Like, this is what I mean about the most important questions. Don't have answers and you need these answers. It's really hard to move forward if you don't have them, right? So how do you work with that? Then I wanted to talk about another form of searching, which is pilgrimage. I think I have a slide. Yes, okay. So another way to think about what I was doing, and actually this is kind of interesting when you think about when I was struggling to figure out how to go to Egypt, and this is important for both pilgrimage and tourism, which I'm going to talk about next. When I was trying to figure out how to go to Egypt, it worked a whole lot better in the context of Egypt for me to tell my guide that I was a pilgrim and I was searching, that I was on some kind of holy quest, than it was for me to tell him that I was a researcher. That was very dangerous. He did not want to host a researcher. He did not want to take a researcher around. He had just recently, and this was 2018, he had just recently had, there was a lot of news about an American researcher who'd been put in jail. And so research was very fragile, but pilgrimage was available as a category. So when I told him that I was on a kind of pilgrimage, suddenly he was like, okay, we can work with that. It didn't matter that I was a Christian, or that this was a Christian pilgrimage or a Christian figure, that didn't matter. But the important thing was that I was not a researcher, because that was very threatening to his particular environment. So when we add pilgrimage to this quest, I think what we add is something about the inner life. A quest is very external, right? So a quest is like, there's a thing, it's out there, I'm gonna go find it. And it doesn't matter what, the nature of the quester isn't super important. You can think about like Indiana Jones. Those movies are not really about the character so much of Indiana Jones, of him, reaching some moment of self-reflection or whatever. No, they're trying to find stuff. And so we have a lot of these questing narratives in our culture. I just was on a podcast where we took Mary of Egypt and the Goonies and put them together because they're both quest narratives, right? So pilgrimage, though, when we start to talk about pilgrimage, we add this layer of the inner life. So some of the great researchers of pilgrimage, Edith and Victor Turner, talk about pilgrimage as extroverted mysticism. And then they talk about mysticism as introverted pilgrimage. So just kind of get your mind around that for a minute. So extroverted mysticism is pilgrimage, and then mysticism is introverted pilgrimage. So you kind of get this thing going on, this inner, outer life, and they're starting to weave together. So I did think about myself as a pilgrim of sorts, but there were lots of problems with that. One of which is that nobody, as far as I know, or as far as I knew until the end of my journey, had ever walked the route of Mary of Egypt. And usually when you're a pilgrimage, you think about the Camino de Santiago, right? I mean, thousands and thousands of people walk that you know exactly where you're going. You can't get lost. And very often our pilgrimages are like that. I was in Jerusalem with millions of pilgrims who all were, getting on and off of air-conditioned buses, and they were looking at this and they were looking at that. There's no route of Mary of Egypt per se. There's no way to connect with other pilgrims who are in search of Mary of Egypt. So this pilgrimage ends up being a really kind of lonely deal, right? Because it's like, have you ever heard of Mary of Egypt? No, not Mary, the mother of Jesus. No, not that one. The other one? Well, she's kind of old and she's really skinny. No. She lived in the desert? No. okay. So everywhere I went, I'd ask. I learned to say Mary of Egypt in all kinds of different languages. But it didn't help because no one had ever heard of Mary of Egypt and nobody was on the path to Mary of Egypt. So that kind of pilgrimage, I don't know. I mean, when Edith and Victor Turner talk about pilgrimage, really one of the key elements is community. It's really connecting. And even Mary, when she went on her own pilgrimage and she embarked from that on that boat from Alexandria, she was in the company of other pilgrims. This is an incredibly important part of her story, right? You can't have sex with people if they're not there. So she was in, and one of the interesting things about Christian pilgrimage, one of the fascinating aspects of it, is the way that it took people from all kinds of different social classes and mixed them together. It's a very exciting time. If you can imagine yourself as a young pilgrim who, came from some small village, maybe in Syria or in what's now Libya. And you're meeting all kinds of people from all over the world, and you're mixing with different social classes, and men and women, in those societies usually were very, very separate, and suddenly they're all sleeping together on the same deck of a ship. So pilgrimage had this wonderful quality of bringing people together and of breaking down social barriers, and it was a very important part of pilgrimage. But I didn't exactly have that to work from. The other thing about pilgrimage, and particularly in our day and age, is its relationship to tourism. Nope, I'll say that. I just didn't make it. I didn't make you a tourism slide, I guess. But right now, it's really very hard for any of us to travel without the structures of tourism. And tourism is so structured. So I'll just give you Egypt as an example. This was 2018, so it was after the Arab Spring. And Egypt was very desperate for American tourists. The whole American tourist economy had really fueled Egypt for a long time, and it had disappeared. So Egyptians were very, very eager for Americans to come. And they had set up all of these structures, for Americans to participate in Egypt. They'd kind of figured out what Egypt meant to Americans, and then they were like, let's feed it to them. But it was really hard as somebody who was trying to see a different Egypt, or who had a different idea of what Egypt might be, to maneuver beyond those structures or maneuver through them. So I had this idea of Mary of Egypt probably traveled from Upper Egypt, oh no, that's not on that map, from Upper Egypt to Alexandria by boat. So I really wanted to do that. I really wanted to spend some time on the Nile traveling up by boat, because I figured that was probably the most likely way that Mary of Egypt did it. But you really can only do this, and there are two means. One is to go on a cruise, a Nile cruise, which I just couldn't reconcile. I just couldn't figure out, how's that going to work? And then I had friends who told me, you just go down to the docks and you just ask some guy and he'll take you up the river. Whoa, I don't know that I can do that either. So I really found myself quite mystified by, okay, so if I want to do this part of the journey, how do I do it? What ended up happening, and it took a long time, but I kept looking for a small company, a singular guide, somebody that would just help me, would listen to my story and help me piece together the Egypt of Mary of Egypt. And I had a lot of failures, I had a lot of mistakes, but finally I did find this guide, and his name is Yahya El-Dekan. He is a tourist guide and a poet and a philosopher and lots of other really fascinating things. And he studied in the United States in the United World Colleges programs. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the United World Colleges, but it's this international, it comes out of the same founders as Outward Bound, and the International Baccalaureate program. So it has all those connections, but it's international campuses all over the world where young people between high school and college can go and study. And he had come to the US and studied in New Mexico. And that's how I found him, through a friend that had been in the United World Colleges program. But anyway, he wrote me this letter, so I think I'll just read it to you. This is after I wrote to him in kind of desperation, thinking this is never going to get off the ground if I can't get to Egypt. I don't know how to do this. I don't know. I can't just show up in Egypt and start asking people if they've heard of Mary of Egypt, right? That's not going to work. So he writes, Good day to you from Cairo. I received your email on Tuesday while driving, and my wife read it out loud. And I have to tell you that we both really enjoyed reading about Mary being a real person, or maybe not. And we are interested to know about your findings and help your story. The research is very specific. I like specific requests of people visiting my country because it's clear that they are appreciating our history and culture. I believe I can help you. And no, you do not need male companions to travel in Egypt, but you might consider bringing some family. Egyptians are family people, and they will understand you better if you have your family with you. I have to tell you, Amy, I had to include this line, even though I took it out about 10 times, put it back in. I have to tell you, Amy, that your writing style is very nice. Best regards, Yahya El-Dekan. And so that was my door. That was my door to begin. Because he said, yes, I can help you. Yes, I know what you need. And he's the one who began to take me and help me answer some of these questions that became really, that were really tricky to answer as we went along. So the first one being, where was Mary of Egypt born? Because all she says is she was born in Egypt. Egypt was my homeland, dear brother. That's all she says. So talking extensively with Yahya, we came to the conclusion that at the very least I should travel to Nubia. Nubia is a place on the far south, what's called Upper Egypt, on the border between Egypt and Sudan. It's where the Aswan Dam is, very famous project from the 20th century. And it's a very, for me as a visitor, as a tourist pretending to be a pilgrim, pretending to be a tourist, it was a very mystical place because camels really do have the right of way in Nubia. And the streets really are made of sand. And people really do live quite a bit like they lived in, and many centuries ago, maybe not so long ago as the 5th century, but many centuries ago. And Yahya wanted me to see that. They live that way by choice. They live on islands in the Nile where there's no electricity and no running water, and they live in very traditional ways, in the ways that they have always lived. So Yahya thought that would be a great place for me to begin looking for Mary of Egypt because I could really see and feel a more ancient Egypt than was available in other places. So I'm going to just quickly talk about some of my discoveries along the way. So one of my discoveries, and this is one of the beautiful things about questing, is that you can be continually surprised. This man over here, Bishop Isidros, was one of the great surprises of my trip, and I'll just tell you a little of that story. Bishop Isidros is a Greek Orthodox bishop who serves the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the most holy place in all of Christendom. It's the place that Queen Helena in the 3rd century decided was the place where Jesus had been crucified and resurrected. So it has both a site to recognize the crucifixion and then a site to recognize the resurrection. And it's a church has anybody been there? You've been there. A few people have been there. To me, it was like a maze or like a dreamscape. It wasn't like any sort of church I'd ever been in. These hallways and they lead places, but you don't know what that means, and there are no signs. And to me, it was just like a really dreamy sort of weird place. I couldn't figure it out. And it actually made me kind of miserable because everybody was taking selfies everywhere in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And yet there were also all these pilgrims, sorry, I'm dry, doing pilgrimy things. And also those things I didn't understand. People bowing and doing things that, I grew up as a Baptist. And I'm just trying to make sense of this place and trying to make sense of myself in it. And I couldn't make any sense of it. So of course, what did I do? I went back to the place where I was staying and I Googled it. There's got to be a way to make sense of this, right? And what I discovered when I Googled the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is that there was a chapel dedicated to Mary of Egypt in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And I've been studying this woman for 10 years. And I had no idea. No one had ever mentioned it. And the guy on the website describes exactly where the chapel is. So the next day, I went back. I tried to follow the directions. I see the chapel of the Franks. Yep. See all the people. Yep. Okay, come outside. Stare in the courtyard. It's supposed to be right under the staircase of the Crusaders' staircase. There's a door. Go to the door. It's locked. There's a door a little bit to the side. It's locked. I keep walking around. There are other doors. They're locked. Finally, this man stops me. He's the doorkeeper, Muslim doorkeeper at the Church of Holy Sepulchre. He's like, "Here, private." And I said, "I'm looking for the Chapel of Mary of Egypt." And he said, "Yeah, it's over there." And I was like, "Really?" Because the website said it's here, but the internet isn't always right. So I went across to where he said it was. There was no Chapel of Mary of Egypt there. That was the Chapel of St. James. He was really just, this is what happened all the time. I don't know, for other of you who've been in Jerusalem, maybe you know this, but people just point you places because there's so many tourists and they're always asking the same questions over and over again. And so people just point them in random directions. It happened to me so many times. I'd ask for one thing and they'd be like, "Yeah, it's right there, that way." Okay, thank you. So anyway, lots of things happened that led me eventually to Bishop Isidros. And Bishop Isidros had the key to the Chapel of Mary of Egypt. And no one had asked for that key in 50 years. And he was a little embarrassed to tell me that he thought it might be lost, but he would go look for it. And so on this really magical day, Bishop Isidro, I thought I was in a fairy tale. I really did, especially when he showed up with the key, which was like that big and like that thick. And I was like, you know, if you're in a fairy tale and somebody shows up with a key like that, you know it's serious. Something big is there and hiding behind that door. So I'll let you read about what happened in the Chapel of Mary of Egypt. I'll save that. No spoilers. So one of the questions, and I'll end with this, one of the questions that I had about going on this kind of pilgrimage was how to look, how to see. What am I looking for, of course, was a huge question. But suppose I did find things that I did want to look at. How should I see them? How should I be looking? And so I developed a list of things that I kind of wanted to see, and I'm sure that if you saw that list, you'd kind of laugh, because it was everything from like, they say that Mary of Egypt was a spinner of wool. And so I wanted to see kind of instruments of wool spinning. I wanted to see how that worked, right? I wanted to see kind of what those things looked like, and even if I could touch them or hold them, that would be especially exciting. We could kind of call that a bucket list, right? I kind of had this list. And I know a lot of Americans do travel this way, right? And we're encouraged to. We're encouraged to think about that to be fully alive, we should have this list of things, of ideas, of places that we want to go and things we want to see, and then we should cross them off, and that will be, really living. And we're encouraged to think like that, right? So what's on your bucket list? It's a fun topic of conversation if you're having dinner with someone. And I kind of had that. I kind of had like this list of things that I wanted to see related to Mary of Egypt as we went along. And then I was thinking about doorways. So Mary of Egypt lived in doorways, according to the literature. And I couldn't make any sense of that. How does a person live in a doorway? It was one of the very first things I asked Yahya, the Egyptian guide. Like, it says she lives in doorways. Could you please tell me how a person... He said, I can't in my American mind make sense of that. Well, it turns out, that doorways, it's a much more expansive thing in Egyptian architecture than it is in American architecture, right? So there are these deep, arched porticos that lead places. And I did get a chance to see them. I was thinking about, I think when I wrote this problem of architecture, actually what I was thinking about was Dallas. Because I've recently been to Dallas for the first time. I was thinking if you went on a quest in Dallas, you would really have a hard time. Because it's all steel and glass. And there really isn't a way in anywhere. And one of the magical things about the landscape that I was traveling through was that there are so many ways in. So many doorways. If you spend time in Jerusalem, you know this. You wander around, you get lost, you get scolded because you actually went into someone's courtyard and you didn't know it because there are so many doorways. And the Chapel of Mary of Egypt ended up being a doorway. And so as a person on both a pilgrimage and a quest, all of these doorways were quite profound for me because you could go in and you can experience the crossing of a threshold. And there's something really profound about that in terms of the inner and outer life. So in this experience of being able to go in and enter, it's a huge deal for Mary of Egypt because her first experience in the courtyard of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was not being able to get in to the church, being spiritually blocked. So she tried to push and fight and get her way in, and she couldn't do it. And this was the life-transforming moment, that no that was spoken from, again, there are no voices ascribed in the text to where the voice was spoken from, but there was a no, a profound, powerful no, you cannot come in here, which was a little bit like I felt, a little bit, standing in the courtyard of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, right? And I was asking every monk in a hat, and I was trying to find as many different hats as I could to ask all the monks, is the Chapel of Mary of Egypt here? Is it here? And the monks were, they're always telling me the wrong thing, like, well, it belongs to the Copts. And so I'd go to the Copts. And they're like, no, the Greeks have it, but it's only open one day a year. And then I'd go to the Greeks, and then they would just refuse to talk to me altogether. And then I went to the Russians, and so I was like going around and around. Here's one profound thing I learned about looking, really important. If you're looking for something, ask the women. The women are the ones who know where things are. So I learned this, but I spent several days asking monks, and they do not know where things are, or they're not very willing to share them. But then I also wanted to consider these three more kinds of looking. Glancing, which I think is pretty much what we do when we go places, pretty much all the time. We glance at things, and then we count it done. And I think this is the phenomena of the selfie, in that sense that you don't know how to encounter this thing. You don't know how to be in front of it. Things have mysteries, and you don't know how to encounter them. So we just take a picture of them. And then maybe we can encounter them later. Maybe later on we'll feel whatever it was we were supposed to feel. Or we'll understand whatever it was we were supposed to understand. But for now, there it is. Yep, thing, yep, check, moving on. And this so much is the way that we're trained to interact. Especially with a strange environment or a place where we're not comfortable, we tend to glance. And I really thought in preparation for this trip, and also while I was on it, that I didn't want to just glance. I wanted to figure out how to behold, how to be in relation to the thing and spend time there. And beholding is a kind of contemplative stance. And again, I was a little bit stuck with the problem that typically, if you take a pilgrim to a site, there's already something there to behold, right? There's already a thing. Like, this is the place where the bones of St. James are. And so you spend some time beholding them, and there's a kind of interaction, that the spiritual thing. Or when I was in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, when Bishop Isidros went to find the key, he said, why don't you go and behold the true cross? And I was like, okay, well, how do I do that? I don't know. But I practiced this a lot while I was there. I would practice beholding. I would sit in front of something that I thought had something to do with Mary of Egypt, and I'd just be with it until some kind of understanding came on me, or my time ran out. That happened too. But I tried to practice being in relation. And the ultimate goal of beholding, after all, is encounter. And I think, of course, that's the most profound experience of seeing that we can have, and it's what Martin Buber calls the I-thou experience, where you truly enter into a relation. And encounter was, after all, the purpose and meaning of this journey. I was attempting to encounter a woman who had lived a very long time ago in a way that I didn't understand, who'd captivated my imagination, and I didn't even know really what encountering her would look like. And Mary was encountering and had this life-changing experience when she allowed herself an encounter with Mary, the Mother of God. And Zosimus was changed profoundly when he encountered Mary in the desert. And so all of us were after this work of encounter, but why? I think it's because encounter is what it takes to be fully alive. And I think what we're after in these searches, really whatever else it is we're looking for an understanding, an experience, even a transformative one, what it means to be fully alive. That's me in Wadi Hassa, in Jordan. So I'll stop there, and then I'll just be happy to take your questions.
Thanks so much, Amy. I loved some of those sentiments that you talked about just now, like beholding and being in the moment with things, and not just glancing at them. So what I'd like to do now is let you all ask questions, and if you would please raise your hand, I'll come around with the mic so that everyone can hear. Since we have masks, it really improves the volume. So let me know if you have a question, and I'll come to you.
Hi there.
Hi.
I apologize if I missed this point, but where did you first encounter Mary of Egypt?
You didn't miss it. I didn't tell the story. I first encountered Mary of Egypt in the Norland Library at the University of Colorado Boulder. I was there finishing the footnotes for my first book, the Rapture Culture book, and I was really obsessed with getting the right page number for all the books. And you couldn't do this on Google Books in those days. You had to actually find the book and look it up and find the page number and make sure you were quoting from the right page. And I really thought nobody would give me a job if I had the wrong page number, and so this is what I was doing. So I was going around getting the page numbers for all the books, and I got really, really hungry, and I just ended up randomly roaming the stacks. I lost my focus. I didn't know what was going on. I just kind of needed to go have lunch, but I couldn't get my mind around that. I'd spent too much time focusing on these little details, and I found myself in the stacks in the Norland Library with a book called The 10 Holy Women of Byzantium in my hand, which had nothing to do with my research. I did not know where Byzantium was. I did not know when Byzantium was. I had some vague idea it sounded Greek. That's it. And then I opened it up and I started reading the story of Mary of Egypt. And I sat down right there in the stacks and I read the story to the end and decided to check the book out. I was like, maybe I'm more interested in Byzantium than I knew. And took it to a deli, and then what I did with it was, it's just one of those weird moments where you're like, what am I doing? Who's this person? I took the story of Mary of Egypt and I copied it out by hand in the deli, leaving out all the words I didn't like, which were most of them. And actually in the book you can see my version of that blacked out version at the back of the book, what remained, the bones of what remained when I did that.
Thank you.
Amy, could you speak about her life as a saint?
Yes, so this is a very good question. The first thing that we have to understand about Mary of Egypt as a saint is that she's an Orthodox saint. So an Orthodox saint is very different from a Christian saint, than a Catholic saint. It's also very different than when Protestants use the word saint, what they mean. So in the Orthodox tradition, almost anybody who did something interesting that other people liked can be a saint. Saint just means pay attention. Saint means here's a story you should care about. That's basically what Sophronius, who is also Saint Sophronius, was saying when he named this the life of Saint Mary of Egypt. But the deep reason for her sainthood was her relationship to the desert and her relationship to the landscape of the desert. And her choice to live in the desert and become intimate with it. And it was in the desert, under the guidance of Mary, the Mother of God, so she had only female role models and only female teachers. It's a really interesting thing about the story of Mary of Egypt, is that all female cast, except for Zosimus, who's the student of Mary of Egypt. So she teaches him. But otherwise, her teacher is Mary, the Mother of God. And they have this intimate relationship in the desert. And then what Mary does in the desert is become profoundly connected to the elements. So this is where Zosimus observes her walking on water. He observes her levitating, rising in the air when she prays. And I take those signals to be, and I guess I've kind of said it, but to be markers of this intimacy with the land and with the elements. Becoming so, I take that even to mean what holiness means in the text. It means this incredible connection to the root of life, to the most elemental aspects of life. This is what Mary of Egypt found in the desert. So to me, that's where her sainthood is found. I think for Sophronius, she lived an exemplary life because she went into the desert and she was transformed there. And transformation is what so many people went into desert seeking, and Mary of Egypt found it. And then I also think he was saying, and I think this took me a long time to understand, but another thing that he was saying is that what you think holiness is, you have no idea, right? So he's like trying to point, he's taking all the monks of his day and he's pointing to this woman and he's saying, that's where it's at, and you haven't even started on your path. So I think those are some of the elements that I would call as important to her sainthood. But she's not a saint in the Catholic Church.
There's a woman up front. Up front? Yeah, up front.
Well, I was interested in what made her a saint. But the other thing is, I want to comment, I loved how you structured your lecture. It's so unusual.
Thank you.
And I feel like it was a poem, like how it was all put together. So
I have to say the whole trip was like a poem. It was like being inside a poem, and I kept thinking, oh, what's happening here? What's happening now? You know, there were all these moments that were like, I'm not directing this. This is coming from some other place. It was very exciting in that way.
but it sounds like she's following you.
Mm.
She found you in that library, and then
It
now
certainly-
we found her through you.
And it certainly felt like she was like if you're in a fairy tale or something, or a myth, right? Like there's this person that's like disappearing and reappearing and disappearing, and you're like, I think let's go that way, and then you get there and you're like, nope, nothing here. You know, it felt that was the kind of feeling that I was in a lot of the time. And the first version, or many versions of this book, had a lot of dreams in it, and eventually the editor was like, nobody's interested, you know, like there's way too many dreams in this book. But I was led by dreams, you know. I would have these dreams and I'd wake up in the morning and think, okay, what does that mean? What should I do with that? And I don't live like that normally. That's not like sort of an ordinary part of my experience. Just something that was very particular to this quest.
So is your book more like about her or about your quest?
It's both. Yeah. The quest is the means that I use to discover her, and so it moves back and forth between her story and then my story and hers and mine. So it kind of goes back and forth.
So now you've discovered her for this new audience, this contemporary audience.
Yeah.
I look forward to meeting her.
I look forward to that too. And I just think that, you know, maybe wouldn't it be funny if like people started going to the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate and asking, could I see the Chapel of Mary of Egypt? Like, wouldn't that be an amazing outcome of this? There's another really important discovery of Mary of Egypt as an actual human being. I came away from this whole thing believing very strongly that she was in fact a human being. She'd lived, she breathed, she taught, she changed people, and there's a record of that has just been completely erased in the American context. And there are a lot of things you can't see from here. You know, you kind of got to go and look around.
I have a question. So, how much of that erasure of her do you think, as a scholar of history, has to do with our culture today, or our history of kind of pushing women down and to the side?
Well, that's certainly where it started. That's certainly where the erasure of Mary of Egypt started. It started she was one of the most popular saints in the Middle Ages, and she was included in the Golden Legend. So when I say she wasn't a Catholic saint, I mean she didn't go through the process that Catholic saints go through today to become saints. But she was included in the Golden Legend, which is a collection of saint stories that was very widely read in the Middle Ages, and hers was one of the most popular. And you can go to all kinds of churches in Europe and see relics of Mary of Egypt. Her finger bone, her toe, her hair, right? And none of this makes any sense to us necessarily. And the thing about hair is fascinating, actually. I'll give a little riff on hair for a moment. In the text, Mary of Egypt has very short white hair. And it's a big deal is made about her short white hair. And so she has dark skin and short white hair. And she's quite old by the time Zosimus meets her and describes her physically. In the European tradition, she suddenly gains an enormous amount of hair, a great deal of hair. So she has and she's no longer has dark skin, and she no longer has short white hair. She has long, luxurious locks that go down to her feet. So part of this is to cover up her nakedness, because she is the most naked saint, in the entire tradition, except maybe John the Baptist being the other most naked saint. But she has all this, but in the European tradition, just has a ton of hair. So you'll find all these. Sometimes it's even weirder than that in the European tradition, where she'll literally look like a werewolf, and she'll just have hair growing out of everywhere. So that's kind of a weird thing. I never really did figure that one out. But let's see, where were we headed? Oh yeah, erasure. So then, of course, you have the Protestant Reformation, which for the American context gets rid of 99.9% of all saints. So for Protestants, this isn't even a question or whatever. And then you have the secular academic tradition, which is profoundly interested in texts. So everything comes from texts. And the question isn't, does this person live? The question is, where did this text come from and how did we get it? And so when you talk to American scholars about Mary of Egypt, what they're interested in is that text that tells her story. And even to ask questions outside the text is a little already kind of naive, So I think in my quest in ways, and when I encountered not necessarily scholars of Mary of Egypt, but kind of the broader scholarship, there was this idea of don't you know this is a legend? Don't you know that this text was produced for the edification of monks? What do you mean you're looking for her? It's a pretty naive. It appeared as a pretty naive quest, but in the end, this isn't at all how she's seen from Jordan, from the perspective of Jordan. From the perspective of Jordan, she lived. Here's where she lived. Here's what we have to prove it. Here's how we found that. So from the perspective of Jordan, it doesn't even, the question of Mary of Egypt living only in text makes no sense at all. So it's this weird, I found myself standing between these two very different traditions and how they understood history and what history was and how we knew about it.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions.
I was just curious, did you take the advice of bringing a relative with you?
That's a great question. I did. I took my mother. Yep. She agreed to go on this trip with me. Of all my relatives, she was the most curious and the most open-hearted and the most interested in the whole thing. And so she signed up right away, and my dad said no thanks. And he'd been to Egypt already, so I'm not trying to make my dad sound like stodgy old guy, but my mom was like, let's go.
Also, how much time did you spend?
I was there for 5 weeks. My mom spent the first 2.5 with me, and then she left, and then I had some time by myself, and then my husband joined me for we trekked from Bethlehem to into the wilderness of Jordan, and so he joined me for the kind of actual walking part. But my mom was an amazing travel guide, and somebody recently just wrote me and said, when the movie comes out, I want to play your mom. And then I told my mom that, and she's like, why?
One last question lingering.
Okay, well, I'll hang around and can sign books, and thank you so much for your time and your attention.
Thank you.